I could just start with the period that you came back from, came back to claims from your naval career and then moved from there as far as we can through your gubernatorial administration. You once said, in fact, said it on a number of occasions, that as early as you could remember, you had ambitions to go to Annapolis and to pursue a naval career, and which you did, of course. And then, after the death of your father in 1953, you rather abruptly ended that career, returned to Plains to manage the family farming and business interest. And you said you hoped to pursue some sort of public service. I'm wondering what sort of public service you had in mind at that time as you were leaving the Navy and coming back to Georgia.
My own father's life was a pattern that I had in mind. He was quite active in education, health problems in Sumter County. He was on the Sumter County Board of Education. He was on the Sumter County Hospital Authority. Daddy was very interested in helping to educate the farmers around Plains, particularly the small farmers, and the latest techniques in agriculture. He was active among young people. I later became Boy Scout master. I was head of the Royal Ambassadors, which is a Baptist version of Boy Scouts. Rosen was a Cub Scout master. The Lions Club in a small town like Plains is a center for not only civic activities but also civic projects. And I became very active in the Lions Club as my father had been. I was the president of the Lions Club, the zone chairman, the deputy district governor. I was finally the head of all the Lions Clubs in Georgia. My father had just gotten involved in the seed business for the first year, and that became the major thrust of my own interest. And I worked with other seedsmen all over the nation to try to, all over the state rather, to improve the quality of sales to farmers. And I became the president of the Georgia Crop Improvement Association, which was responsible for all kinds of seed, not just peanuts. And I was a state chairman of the March of Dimes. I was a state chairman for the Society for the Prevention of Blindness. And I was a chairman of the Better Hometown contest effort in Plains. We won 2 state prizes and 2 second place prizes in the state. I was quite interested in bringing together the disorganized small communities in my region, and we organized one of the first, perhaps the first, area planning and development commissions in the state. At that time, it was known as the West Central Georgia Planning and Development Commission, 8 county area. And I was the chairman, the organizer, and I served as the only staff member for a while. When Daddy was very interested too in education, in addition to the school system, and when the Head Start program came along, I coordinated the Head Start program in that region. I had 21 Head Start programs under my direction. Those are the kinds of things that I felt were important. And this doesn't count work in the church and so forth.
Did you have any thought of running for public office in that earlier period?
No, my father was a first-term legislator when he died. He was elected in 1952 and died in July '53. And at the time of my father's death, the delegations came from around the county and offered the position to my mother, who was a registered nurse and a bereaved widow. Of course, she turned it down. And then one of my father's best friends in Plains and a neighbor ran for the position, and he served for 8 years or so. I never was tempted to run against him. It wouldn't have been appropriate in my judgment. But then when they reorganized the state senate, there was a threat to the public school system in our state. Ernest Vandiver and others were saying, no, not one, we'll close the public school system down before we let blacks come in. So I was chairman of the Sumter County Board of Education by then. And so I ran for the state senate with the sole purpose of improving or protecting the education system in the state. When I got to the Senate, my only request was I be put on the education committee. And I was very eager and knowledgeable about the subject, So I was the secretary of the education committee even as a freshman, and I was chairman of the university committee. And that was my major thrust. I was also on the appropriations committee later on. And so I went to the state senate primarily because of my interest in education.
You mentioned that your mother had been asked to fulfill your father's term.
Yes.
And I think you'd mentioned at one time that your father had taken an increasing interest in politics throughout his life. Did your mother have an interest at this time?
A peripheral interest. Daddy was one of the first directors of the Sumter Electric Membership Corporation, and he became active in protecting the REA system. And that was his first entree into state and then therefore national politics. He would go to Washington to lobby along with other farmers to protect the REA system, and he would go to national conventions of the REA. And it was only a good while after that, this was when I was 14, which was 1938 or so, and it was not until 53 that he decided to run for the legislature.
It's interesting. We share an experience with REA. I grew up in a very rural area of eastern Montana. We didn't get electricity until 1941.
Right.
And REA brought it. My father was on it.
Roosevelt kind of gave Georgia priority since he was living a lot of his time down in at Warm Springs. So Georgia had some of the earliest REA programs.
You said that your father sort of broke with FDR with the production controls of the first AAA.
Yes.
Did he oppose then other New Deal programs as well?
Not really. What my father objected to was a government requiring farmers to plow up cotton and to kill hogs and to waste the crops of that in that way. Daddy thought that was an unwarranted intrusion into his own personal farm affairs by the federal government.
Those
so
farmers did.
That was his main objection to it. But I think the programs like CCC and obviously REA were very significant to my daddy and to the younger people in the community then.
Your father then didn't really join other New Deal critics like Eugene Talmadge and Walter George.
Yes, Daddy was a strong supporter of George. When Roosevelt tried to defeat Walter George and in his effort to pack the Supreme Court, Daddy was an open and active supporter of Walter George. At that time, there was a man named Camp, I think, who was put forward to run as a so-called Roosevelt candidate, and Walter George just cleaned out because Daddy and most Georgians resented the fact that Roosevelt would dare to interfere in the U.S. Senate race down here. So Daddy was quite aware of politics and quite active in supporting his chosen candidates, but he didn't have ambitions to run himself until the last part of his life.
I seem to recall that your mother, by 1964, had become a very active supporter of Lyndon Johnson. When did her interest in politics?
Well, Mother was always, for those days, quite liberal on the race issue. She was the most liberal white person that I ever knew. She was strongly opposed to the adverse consequences of racial segregation, quite different from my father, who was quite conservative on the subject. And Mother was a great admirer of the Kennedys, particularly John Kennedy, who was the main one she knew, and Bobby. She was distressed. She was in the Peace Corps when Bobby Kennedy was killed, and it was a very serious blow to her. When she came back home and Lyndon Johnson was running, as you know, as you may remember, he didn't try to campaign in Georgia or the South. I think his wife came through. And it was almost impossible to get anybody to head up the Johnson campaign. In our region, it was Goldwater days and Bo Calloway days in that region. Mother volunteered to be Johnson's county campaign chairwoman. And she organized headquarters over in the Windsor Hotel in Americus. And she was abused pretty severely. She would come out of the headquarters every day and her car would be written all over with soap, and a radio antenna would be broken and things of that kind, which didn't obviously deter my mother. And I was active to some degree then. I remember the Secretary Freeman Secretary of Agriculture, Oliver Freeman, came down to try to have a Johnson rally in Americus, and he couldn't get anyone to organize a rally for him. So we helped with that, and he had a few thousand people, mostly blacks, I would say, who came out. But so Mother was was active in her own way.
Was race the primary issue there, or was it
Yeah.
support for Goldwater?
Goldwater ran a very subtle racist campaign. He never did say that, but it was looked upon as having that connotation. Johnson was looked upon as a, quote, nigger lover, ultra liberal, betrayed the South, and my mother felt that he was the right person for the job, that the Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Acts, were highly beneficial to our country, as did I. My wife and I and all our children were strong and open supporters of Lyndon Johnson. But Mother was a county chairman. But the whole race had racial connotations, although I certainly wouldn't accuse Senator Goldwater of being a racist. But there was a subtlety there that was significant.
You mentioned in your 1975 memoir, Why Not the Best, that your experiences growing up in a society in which racial segregation was sort of the norm.
Yes, it was.
And then by 1950, when you returned on leave from the Navy, you, I think, had an argument with your father over an incident that occurred at Nassau.
Yes.
When did you begin to recognize that there was something unjust about racial discrimination? And was there an incident? Or?
In the Naval Academy, we had the first black midshipman when I was there. And I was a great admirer of Harry Truman, who tried to integrate the armed services as much as possible in those days. That's a latter part of the 1940s. And on a submarine, where I was attached, beginning in 1950, the USS Key-1, there was no distinction at all between black and white sailors. In fact, there was no wardroom. It was a tiny submarine, an anti-submarine vessel, and we all lived and ate and played games and went to social events together. We were in St. Thomas, I think it was, one of the Caribbean islands. I've forgotten exactly where it was. Anyway, the K-1 was tied up, and we were invited out by the British Governor General to bring our submarine crew to a banquet. And I was the officer of the deck in charge of the submarine while the captain was ashore. And the British sent a message back to me, a lieutenant or someone, and said that, of course, the invitation only applied to the white sailors. So I informed the messenger that no one would come. I was sure. So when the captain came back, I told the captain about that episode, and he said that was right, that no one would go. So we didn't go. And when I got home from that cruise and went home and told my father about it, he was horrified that I would have acted that way. So that was the first day I was home on a 2-week leave. And so my father and I just agreed that we wouldn't discuss a race issue while I was home. Mother thought that what I did was right, what we did was right.
If I could return just briefly to your service on the county school board, excuse me, I know that you made a major effort to promote a county consolidation effort that was ultimately defeated.
That's right.
And you talked about your frustration with that. Well, was there anything else in your position as a member of the county school board that you got involved with, curriculum decisions, teacher training, or teacher effectiveness?
Well, I was involved in the entire process because I was chairman of the school board. And we had 7 members, and the board was extremely active. We had monthly meetings, and then the chairman met with the school superintendent, not daily, but more than once a week. The superintendent would come to Plains and talk to me about, hiring practices and Social Security problems and building concerns and repairs and budget, as well as curriculum. And we we made as much progress as we could under the circumstances. One of the first things that I demanded when I got on the board as a neophyte was that we visit the schools in the county. The board had never done that before. And assess the relationship between the black and white schools. And I think this is maybe sounds ridiculous, but I think for the first time the board was brought to realize that the white kids were riding to school on buses, the black kids were walking. The white kids had fairly good schools, new school books. The black kids were going to school in 26 different grammar schools, so-called, in the basement of churches and in the back room of houses. And we went in one schoolroom for black kids and had these little tiny chairs for 3-year-olds, and they had 16-year-old boys trying to sit on those chairs. When the whites wore out school books, the worn-out school books were given to the blacks, and the new school books would go to the whites. Well, we made a real effort to correct those deprivations of blacks. Even under the Supreme Court, it was supposed to be separate but equal. It was not any equality about it at all. And this really preyed on my mind. It was a very serious reflection, I felt, on our country and on our region and on our county. And slowly but surely, the attitudes changed around home. I was up in North Georgia one time, and the deacons voted not to let blacks come in our church. And Rosen, I was planning on running for public office. And Rosen tried to convince me not to go back to church to the meeting when the deacon's recommendation had to be decided. But we drove all the way back from Roswell to Plains, got there in time for church. And I got up and made what I consider to be an impassioned speech that the church ought to be open to all people. And then we had to vote. There were about 250 people in church. That one of the biggest conference we ever had. And there were 6 people that voted my way, my family, and one other older gentleman I think was deaf and didn't quite understand what was going on. 50 voted to keep the church segregated, and almost 200 people didn't vote, which I think was a good indication that the times were changing. And a lot of the young people who didn't vote called me that afternoon and came by my house kind of casually and said, "I think you were right, but I couldn't vote your way." So this was a time of transition, and I never did anything that was courageous about integration, but it was on my conscience and on my mind, and that's one of the things that I tried to do when I got to the state Senate. We had a vote in the Senate quite early on. You might remember the horrible 30 questions that we used to ask in order to qualify for votes, to vote registration. If a white person came in the voter's registrar's office, they would be given a perfunctory approval. If a black person came in, they would ask him 30 questions that you couldn't answer today. I mean, they would find technicalities in the Georgia Constitution law. It was impossible to answer them. So the Senate took the leadership. I made my first speech in the Senate to try to do away with those 30 questions, and we were successful. And there was a national program to outlaw lynching, which seems ridiculous now. This was in the early 60s, and the Senate voted almost unanimously to do away with the permission for lynching or something like that. Senator Russell got upset about it, but this was a formative stage of transition.
Could you talk a little bit more about that first speech on the 30 questions? What brought that about?
Yeah, I
what was the
remember.
response of your colleagues?
I remember the speech I made. One of the points I made, the people who were against any change said, we don't want ignorant people who are not familiar with Georgia laws and not familiar with the Georgia Constitution to be voting and choosing our leaders. And the illustration I made was, suppose there's a totally illiterate person sitting in front of the Sumter County Courthouse selling pencils, and the sheriff came along and kicked him or made him get away from the courthouse. That person would have a much better means of judging who ought to be sheriff than some political science teacher at Georgia Southwestern College. That was my main thrust of my speech. It wasn't a very profound speech. But anyway, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to do away with the 30 questions. the record is there. I don't remember the exact vote, but might be, if you're interested, you can look up the record.
Unfortunately, the debates and the speeches are not carried in the record of the.
But the final
Georgia
votes
General.
are on.
The final vote is.
You can see the final
and
vote.
The bills introduced are
Yeah.
listed. I had seen that in your.
But those are changing times, most Georgia people were looking for a way to change, and they wouldn't comply with commands from HEW. But once the Supreme Court ruled, there were 200 school systems in Georgia, 159 counties and about 40 private systems. Every one of them universally complied with the Supreme Court ruling. There was no defiance in Georgia. There was no standing in the schoolhouse door. I think Georgia was ready to make the transition.
Let's move to your election to the state senate, rather. It was our election.
You ought to write a book about that. That'd be an interesting book.
Did that influence your attitude towards party politics and the established political?
Yeah, it did. There was a disgusting situation. When the one person, one vote ruling came down, and the existing Georgia Senate was outlawed, then that's when I decided to run for office in the summer of '62. And I ran a last-minute hurried campaign, 18 hours a day, literally, working to be elected. And then I went into the Quitman County box ahead. And I lost the Quitman County box by like 130 votes. You'd have to look up the exact figures. There were only 300 people that voted in the county. There were 430-something ballots in the box. 120-something people voted alphabetically. And I watched as this hoodlum, Joe Hurst, put ballots in the box. He had an open pasteboard box with a hole about this big in the top, and that was a voting box. That was a ballot box, and he would put ballots in. He was so powerful that he had no concern about my seeing him perform these illegal acts. He was the state legislator. He was chairman of the Democratic Party in Quitman County. He was a full-time employee of the Commission of Agriculture, Phil Campbell. He could deliver, up until that time, 2 unit votes to anyone he chose. He was a very great favorite of the local Superior Court judge, Judge Walter Gear, who's Peter Zach Gear's uncle. And his wife was a welfare officer. And Joe Hurst personally delivered the welfare checks to people who thought that the checks were coming from him. And he would personally strike people's names off the welfare list through his wife if they didn't comply with his commands. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, I challenged his decision and took it to court. Most people thought I was just a young sorehead who had lost an election legitimately and was a sore loser. And I couldn't get it. Carl Sanders at the same summer was nominated to be governor, and it was impossible to get Sanders to pay any attention to me. I mean, it wasn't his fault. And I finally got a reporter from the Atlanta Journal, John Pennington, to pay some attention to the problem. So John Pennington came down, and a young lawyer, Warren Fortson, who's Ben Fortson's youngest brother, was in Sumter County, and he helped me. And we started going over getting affidavits and all from people whose names were on the voting records but who did not vote, and to show that the election in the county was so shot through with fraud, there was no way to tell how the election came out. And it went back and forth. There's no need to take up your time discussing it, but from the Superior Court back to the county Democratic Committee and so forth. Ultimately, the Supreme Court Justice, who now happens to be the Chief Justice of Georgia, Tom Marshall, decided that the thing was so confused that he was taking everybody's name off the ballot. And the night at midnight, before Election Day, before the runoff time, well, 2 of the ordinaries in the county said they would not take any names off the ballot, that they got their orders not from a Superior Court judgment, from the Secretary of State. So to make a long story short, I finally won by 1,500 votes. And my opponent, who was he was a nice guy, challenged the outcome of the election, and we went all the way to the Georgia Senate, who had the ultimate responsibility of deciding who won and who lost, and the Senate decided that I had won. But it was a terrible example of corruption in the election system of our state, and also was a terrible reflection on the adequacy of the election law. So one of my main goals when I got into the Senate and got acquainted with the rules and procedures was to get past a new election law, which we did. We got a new code based on my own experience there to a large degree. One of the things it did was to prevent convicted felons from serving in the state legislature, which ultimately caused Joe Hurst to have to resign. He was a convicted felon. He had been indicted 8 times for manslaughter and other crimes.
Was he allied with the Callaway interests in Columbus, LaGrange?
Not directly, no. That's further down the river from Callaway. But Hearst had always been very adept at delivering his county's 2-unit votes to people who were likely to win, and so people were obligated to him. You know, for a statewide election for Court of Appeals or Supreme Court, or governor, or lieutenant governor, county commission, commissioner of agriculture, or labor commissioner, they would go to Joe Hurst, who could personally deliver 2-unit votes. Fulton County only had 6-unit votes. Quitman County had 2-unit votes. So he had built up a tremendous amount of political influence in that way. And he was ultimately convicted of a federal crime of manufacturing and selling illegal liquor and sent to prison. And then he was powerful enough from prison to have his wife elected to replace him. Her name was Mary Hurst, the former welfare director. And then later, one of Rosalind's distant cousins, who had been county school superintendent, ran for state legislature and won. But it's a very complicated thing. I've just described to you the peak of the iceberg. It was really an interesting event. But it did make me feel, a lack of confidence in the electoral system and in the party structures. That was my first experience with elective politics. One Bobby Rowan, he was a very funny guy from down in Nigma, Georgia, introduced a bill, an amendment to the reform bill, election reform bill, saying that henceforward in Georgia, no one could vote in an election for the state legislature who had been dead more than 3 years. There were probably at least 100 people who voted in that election who were dead.
Given the circumstances of your election in the Senate and the fact that you were a freshman, how did you get the chairmanship of a major Senate committee?
I worked harder than almost anyone. I had made the foolish promise when I was running that I would not go up and vote blindly on bills, that I would read every bill in the legislature, which was a silly thing to do. There are about 2,500 bills introduced in the legislature every year, and about 1,200 of them get to the floor for a vote. About 600 are passed. And later, when I was governor, I vetoed about 75 of them. That's a rough estimate. But I would go out to the Senate. I didn't have any office then. None of the legislators had office unless you were the governor's floor leader or something. And I would read all the bills for the day. And I would make notes on the margins about things that were of concern to me. So eventually, people who were interested in the bill would come to me. I was just a freshman. And they would say, Jimmy, is there anything about this bill that you really don't think is good? And I would say, well, it looks all right to me except this one paragraph. And they said, why don't we change the paragraph? And in the final days of a Senate session, even that first year, a guy named Ford Spinks, who was later on the Public Service Commission, and I, on the final day of the legislature, that we would vote on like 100 bills. And they would basically leave it up to me and Ford to decide which bills would come and be voted on in a pro forma fashion, which ones would be debated harshly. And it was primarily because I worked hard, and I had a good background, as a Naval Academy graduate, as a very aggressive and eager member of the local school board, and I was pretty well known in the state because of some of the things that I described to you in the SEED organization and Lions clubs and things like that.
Was that beneficial to you in your later political campaigns, the
Yeah.
contacts that you've made in the planning and state
Yeah,
planning?
particularly when I ran for governor, yes. Because I think at that time there were 208 Lions clubs in Georgia, and I had been to visit a lot of them. and every member of the Lions Club knew me, knew about me, or knew me personally. In fact, we organized a Peach Bowl that year when I was head of the Lions Clubs, and we did some nice things. And so I was trying to run a business, trying to take care of my family affairs, active in almost anything that came around in Sumter County. I was either chairman of it or on the active committee, and it was just an exciting time for me. And that's what I envisioned when I came home from the Navy. I had the best job in the Navy. I was one of Rickover's 2 young officers in charge of nuclear submarines. I had a top job in the Navy, but I could see that my father's life, in all its many faceted aspects, was more exciting, more challenging, more interesting, and had greater promise than the one I had in the Navy. So I had no ambition to hold public office or to run for the legislature or anything else. And when I ran for the legislature, for the state senate, that was my ultimate goal in politics. I didn't have any idea then of going how. But after I'd served 2 terms, then being chairman of the university committee, I was able to get a 4-year college in Americas, and that ensured that I could have re-election really without any opposition. That was a great achievement for them. We had 1 million people in Southwest Georgia and no 4-year college, and so we got the 4-year college. And then I decided to run for Congress. Bo Calloway was my nemesis, and vice versa. And so I ran for Congress against Calloway. And then in June, I was making good progress. I doubt if I could have won. In June, he withdrew to run for governor. Ernie Vanderbilt ostensibly had a heart attack. And, so when Bo withdrew to run for governor, I had the Congress seat almost without opposition. But I withdrew from the Congress race to run for governor. And that was in 1966, at the last minute. And I was making good progress, but I didn't. I came in 3rd. And then so I just kept running until 1970.
I've never seen a really good explanation for that switch.
Well, sometimes I'll explain it to you. We got it. I think our time is spot up.
I'm sorry?
I think our time is up. Nancy says. I don't know if we got 3 questions now. You ask the kind of questions that take a long time to answer.
We've got a lot of questions.
Well, I hope that's adequate.
I really do appreciate your taking the time. And you did a videotape interview with for the governor's conference.
Tifton.
And we're getting that transcript.
Okay, well, I think that covers some of the things that I did as governor.
As governor.
When I was finally elected, I had a very full agenda. I knew what I wanted to do. And the major thrust was quite controversial, to totally reorganize the state government and to do away with all the different bonding authorities and have general obligation bonds, and to create a Department of Natural Resources and Department of Human Resources, to eliminate dozens and dozens of little agencies and bureaus and boards and commissions. We did all that. We had a very good analysis of the state's health system called Cripplers and Killers of Georgia People, and we did a similar thing when I was president, the outcome of which was a book by the Surgeon General called Healthy People, where we analyzed the possibilities of preventive health care. So a lot of the things that I knew from my mother, who was a registered nurse, and knew from the education process, carried on up to the White House. Creation of an education department in the federal government. But I enjoyed being governor. It was a very fine position. And we attempted an awful lot and accomplished a good many things.